All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our Diversity in Places of Influence webinar. We have your cameras turned off because of connectivity issues. You're also muted. However, we invite you to interact with us in the chat. We also have at the bottom, if you move your mouse, your cursor to the bottom of your screen, we have a question and answer function. We invite you to post questions there, but if you post them in chat, that's okay too. We will find them and share them with the panelists. There's going to be a question and answer session at the very, very end. And if you have any difficulties, we are also here. We have Kevin Slyman, who's the head of communications at the Institute of Energy and Environment, Penn State University. We are happy to have having him support us. We also have George Forden and Stephen Alexander helping us in the chat to engage with you, interact with you, and also answer some questions and share the questions with the panelists. I'm going to hand over to Rob Crane to give the welcoming remarks. Welcome, Rob Crane.
Thank you, Esther, and I'm very, very happy to introduce and welcome you to this session. My name is Robert Crane. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Global Programs at Penn State. I'm also a professor of geography. And this particular session is important to us, and it's important to us in a number of ways, right? Because there's several things about this whole webinar that resonate very strongly with global programs. It's international, and of course, my particular role in global programs is building our strategic partnerships around the world. So I take a lot of pleasure in seeing a session like this organized. It's also focused on diversity. And when you look at what Penn State does in the global arena, we bring in something like 10,000 international students a year to our campuses. We send about 3,000 of our own students abroad every year. We have maybe another 1,000 to 1,500 visiting international scholars at any time on the campus. We have our faculty, our researchers publish about a third of their publications are with international co-authors, with about a little over 2,500 different institutions around the world. And all of that connectivity, all of that networking, all of the collaboration happens simply because of that first sentence in the description for this webinar, right? Where you say that diversity of viewpoints leads to innovation. And it's that diversity of viewpoints that we're particularly interested in. And I don't think you'd find a university leader anywhere in the US, probably anywhere in the world, that would disagree with that. So I'd love to be able to tell you that actually academia has all this solved, but I can't, right? If you look at the most recent data for the US, and look at just university presidents, only about 30% of them are women. Now that's gone up 20% in the last 30 years. Whether you think a 20% increase is good over a 30-year period or not, I'll leave that up to you to think about. But if you look at PhD granting institutions, it gets a little worse. It's only 22%. And it's not just the US, because if you look around the world, at first glance, you see women presidents in some of the top universities around the world. So the number one ranked in the Times Higher Education rankings, world rankings of universities. The number one university is University of Oxford, and Oxford, as I'm sure you all know, has a woman vice chancellor. Harvard did until a couple of years ago. If you look around the world now, the London School of Economics does, Imperial College does, a few Ivy Leagues in the US, University of California at Berkeley, McGill, University of Monash in Australia, all have women presidents or vice chancellors. But when you look at that Times Higher Education rankings and look at the top 50 universities, there's only 10 women or vice chancellors or presidents in that group. And if you look at the top 200 universities, it's 39. It's still 20%. So I think we still have a long way to go. And if we come back to the US and look at presidents, university presidents, by racial breakdown or racial minority, then I think it's something like 17% of presidents are. And if you combine the two, women of color, only 5% of university presidents are women of color. So I think academia has a long way to go. And so I'm very interested in listening to the discussion from our panelists here. I think it's going to be very informative for all of us. So I'd like to welcome you once again and then turn you over to Deb Pullen, who's the Executive Director of BRE Trust, and she's going to introduce this session. Deb.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'm Deborah Pullen, the Exec Director of the BRE Trust. But prior to that, I spent a lot of my career delivering and directing materials and manufacturing research in quite a few sectors. I guess it was only really when I came to work in the built environment, though, that I realised probably more than anything how important it is that we consider people in what we create and operate as buildings. And to get that insight, we need to have to make sure that all those people who design, build, operate assets also reflect that diversity. And I think in the trust in recent times, we've tried to get under the skin of buildings and assets and really try to understand the interaction that they need to have for the people in them. So the opportunity to influence today's presentations and to shape the event with Esther was really important to me. And I hope that you'll be able to share your views and knowledge today. There's a wide, diverse group of attendees. You'll also see from the bios of our presenters, they've all certainly earned their stripes to be here with their experience, both in construction, but also in recognised leaders in diversity. So we've also got complementing disciplines and also representing the needs of focus of global society, industry and education. So I'm sure they'll bring their own perspectives on that. We also bring together the UK and US, obviously through, Esther and I been working together for a while now, but also a much wider network. So, it's a global challenge, so it needs a global approach to improve and future-proofing. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Mrs. Maimunda Hamid Sharif, has been the Executive Director of the United Nations Human Settlements Programme since 2017. She's also currently the Mayor of the City Council of Penang Island in Malaysia, but started her career as a town planner and became Director of Planning and Development in Penang in 2003. So today, Ms. Sharif will set the scene by providing an insight to the global impacts that diversity can bring to meet the unique needs of different demographic groups, markets and cultures. She's pre-recorded her presentation as she was called away to another session, but we're also really lucky to have Angela Muai, who's Head of Human Rights and Social Inclusion for UN Habitat, on the panel to answer any questions. Thanks, Kevin.
Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I would like to start with thanking the organizers of this Diversity in Positions of Influence initiative, which aims at creating a movement of action to achieve diversity in the building and built environment sector. Statistics show that women make up only 60% of the total global qualified professionals in the built environment. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, reports that of the more than 134,000 members worldwide, women represent only 15%. The proportion drops to around 1% for professionals who are LGBTQ, BAME, we stand for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic or people with disabilities. It is crucial that the built environment sector has a diverse and inclusive workforce that represents the global community. Let me elaborate why with a few examples. First, gender biases in the built environment contribute directly to gendered social and economic inequities. For example, on transport, women's mobility patterns are very different from men. Women have multi-trip mobility chains and are more likely to use public transport or non-motorized transport. They are less likely to have access to a car in a one-car household. Yet, we focus on building more roads for private cars rather than investing public transport system or walking and cycling infrastructure. In Kenya, together with a local NGO, we applied a tool called Mobility of Care, which analyzes the different mobility needs of women from low-income settlements. We then use this information to inform better public transport services and infrastructure in several cities. Second, a process where women and girls are actively co-creating plans and projects will result in solutions that meet their needs and priorities. In Gaza, Palestine, which has been affected by years of war, through involving women and girls in a marginalized region, we work to create community spaces and reduce gender-based violence. The collaboration during the design process and the employment of female architects helped to advance this mission even further, resulting in safer public spaces in the Gaza Strip. Third, alongside gender, reflecting on intersectionalities like ethnicity and age help to ensure a better understanding of the diverse needs of groups in society. In one of our recent projects in Somalia, migrants and displaced persons, including women and girls, have been engaged in the rebuilding process and have directly benefited from vocational training in building and construction. In Afghanistan and Iraq, as part of our work with displaced and returnee population, we have insisted that women and girls be included in land, housing, and property rights schemes and resettlement solutions designed by the communities. Dear friends, UN Habitat looks forward to further collaboration with the Penn State University Global Building Network on how to encourage, equip, and empower women in the built environment profession. Going further, we should look at the intersectionality to ensure that those who are doubly or triply marginalized due to their gender, age, disability, income, refugee, or migrant status are not being left behind. This will go a long way towards creating vibrant, inclusive, sustainable cities for all. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. If we now move on to our next speaker, so I'm delighted to introduce Maria Coulter, who started her career as a quantity surveyor and has since developed her career as a qualified personal and business coach, and was awarded the British Empire Medal in 2019 for services to diversity and inclusion in the construction sector. Maria is also the chair of the UK Construction Industry Council Diversity and Inclusion Panel and played an instrumental part in developing and launching the Roadmap for Change in March 2020. So her presentation today, she'll provide some insight to the roadmap and also discuss particularly how SMEs and micro businesses play a critical part in our industry and need to be part of the conversation and the improvement. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully everybody will be able to see my presentation. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here today and thanks for the introduction, Deborah. I thought you might like to see a photograph of me in 1989, just before I was going to start university. So apologies for the dodgy hairstyle, but you know, there was a lot that happened then in the late 80s. But we were so rare. So I was just about to start my qualification in quantity surveying, which in the US I think is cost engineering. And we were so rare that we actually made the local newspaper, because it was, you know, a woman in a man's world. So and you know, listening to the percentages in the previous presentation, in the last sort of 10 years or so, I don't really think that much has changed. That's certainly my perception from a percentage perspective. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges that we're facing in the industry at the moment around diversity and inclusion, and also what we're looking to do about it. So what we've actually started with the Roadmap for Change. And I'm going to give you some background as to how it all came about. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Construction Industry Council. So my role there is, so it's a not-for-profit organisation. My role is I'm a non-executive director for them, and I also chair their diversity and inclusion panel. And the organisation represents the key professional bodies in the built environment. So people like the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, which I'm a member of. They are members of the Construction Industry Council, the Royal Institution of British Architects, BRE are members as well. So we represent professional bodies, research organisations, and specialist business associations as well. And our mission is to improve the UK construction industry by collectively representing and supporting the built environment professions. So about 2 years ago, the Construction Industry Council celebrated their 30th anniversary, and the Diversity Inclusion Panel, so we came up with this idea of doing a survey and asking some challenging questions. So we wanted to know, well, what do we need to do to make the built environment the industry of choice so in the next 30 years, basically, because we know we've got challenges attracting the next generation, we have challenges retaining. Let's go out and ask some questions and get some data that we can work with. So the questions that we asked was, you know, what is the one biggest challenge that the industry needs to address to make it one of choice in the next 30 years? Is there any specific aspect that would make you consider leaving? And do you think that the industry is doing enough to attract, retain and develop an inclusive workforce? So these were some of the questions that we were asking. And we had over 1,000 responses. But what's interesting as well, and what did influence the data, was there was quite a lot of small businesses responded to this as well, which I'll talk about more in a little while. And this is some of the data that came back. So we had a lot of qualitative data. So I'm going to share with you some insights from that data. But 72% of the sample thought that the industry is not doing enough to attract, retain and develop a diverse workforce. 42% of the sample said that procurement models, late payments and rates of pay would cause them to leave the industry. And also 35% of the sample have cited lack of work-life balance as a reason to leave the industry. And this data came back in March of last year. So that was when we closed the survey. So I know the world's changed a lot since then, but I think, you know, a lot of these challenges still remain. And these are some of the qualitative data that came out. So, you know, what would make you leave? Well, these are some of the quotations. So I feel as a Muslim female, the industry doesn't seem to want to listen to BAME minorities and not being taken seriously. Racism and bullying at workplace being ignored by the director, attitude and lack of positive action for inclusive design, lack of career progression and investment in individuals, and thoughts on diversity and inclusion. So the image of the industry where marketing itself is still primarily older white males. I'm a straight white man, but it's ridiculous how weighted the industry is to people like me. And some of the things that came back about the biggest challenges, so around improve and embrace a new technology, and also the industry is increasingly driven by lowest cost, resulting in a race to the bottom, and this adversely impacts on behaviours of all parties. some more information that came back. So, you know, what would make you leave? The culture that exists from 20 years ago, it can make women feel uncomfortable, especially when exposed to it for a long time. Diversity in employment, I find the job hunting process very difficult within the planning industry. When I choose to have children, I don't think it's an industry I could continue to work in, with long hours sometimes expected and the chance of having to work away from home. The recent experience of my daughter as an apprentice has been very poor. I'm embarrassed on behalf of our industry for it, and we need to do much better. Behaviours are led from the top, so a lot of company leadership needs to start performing. I joined for the problem solving, challenges, creativity, innovation, working in teams, amazing travel opportunities that came within the industry. What I didn't sign up for was the macho and oppressive environment I find myself in. So these are some of the quotations, some of the data that came back, but also highlighting challenges further. And this is something that Deborah said about SMEs and micro businesses. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we've got is around the demographics of the industry. So there are 1 million small businesses in the UK construction industry, and I think that percentage equates to roughly about 96% of the construction industry is made up of SMEs and micro businesses. So I think we've got a big challenge in really engaging with these small businesses. And something that really struck to mind about the first presentation talked about like not leaving anyone behind. I was at a seminar last year and I saw Ban Ki-moon speak about sustainability, and he talked about not leaving anybody behind with that and everybody pulling together. And I think that we are leaving small businesses behind with regards to diversity and inclusion, because a lot of these small companies aren't engaged in this agenda, and we need them to do a lot more to actually help us improve the industry. And also, where are they represented as well? So we've got a construction industry training board that there's about 61,000 members, you know, small businesses who are engaged with the construction industry training board. We've got the Federation of Master Builders is about 7,500. The National Federation of Builders 1,000. I know a lot of the professional organisations will have members from small businesses as well. I don't have all of the data, but it just gives you an idea of the challenge that we're facing with regards to small businesses. But also I think another challenge that I wanted to highlight is I don't have time. And this is something that it really struck a chord with me when I read this article over the summer. So this is a US article that I read, and I've put the link to it as well. So researchers from the Non-Profit Centre for Talent Innovation, so they carried out some research, and they asked white, straight, cisgender men with white-collar jobs in the US about their views on diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace. 10% thought that it wasn't important, 48% and 42% thought that it was, and the latter group were dubbed as true believers by the researchers. But only 56% of that 90% were actively supporting this agenda in their jobs. And the most common reason was that they were too busy not to get involved, and said that they were more focused on accomplishing the tasks that were asked of them rather than focusing on this agenda. And according to this research, EDI is still seen as extracurricular. And also this quotation that I've put on this slide as well really struck a chord. So Richard Threlfall, who's Global Head of Infrastructure for KPMG, he said, one of my observations is that you look at who is championing the cause of women in the industry, it's mostly women. The cause of ethnic minorities is mostly led by individuals who identify as BAME. And the cause of LGBT plus inclusion by individuals who identify as part of that community. So what does that tell us? A CEO doesn't delegate responsibility for growth. Delegations away from the top says one thing. Relative to other stuff, this doesn't really matter. And I think, you know, that does definitely strike a chord when, you know, when I go to conferences, when I speak at events, you know, you preaching to the converted quite often, and it has to come from the top. You know, the top leaders have to engage in this agenda. I mean, the good news is there's a lot of positive things that are happening in the industry right now, and this is just from the UK. So we've got training, there's free training available in fairness, inclusion and respect, and that's specifically focused for small businesses. The Royal Academy of Engineering are doing some fantastic work as well, and there's a toolkit available on there. You've got the Construction Industry Training Board, who have got Be Fair framework. There's a best practice hub for considerate constructors as well. So there's a lot of free available material for people to engage with. Building People is an initiative that's happening at the moment that's trying to bring initiatives together and join the dots with what's already out there. And you've got leaders, you know, in the contracting field who are looking at this, or Sir Robert McAlpine are supporting the Flex Appeal about greater flexibility. And you've got things like people like BAM, Skanska and Wilmot Dixon are looking at flexible working. I mean, I know this has changed. We're all been flexible working for the past sort of few months because of the pandemic. This is a slide that Wait shared at a recent conference about how they are looking at the data. So they're looking at where they are now. They've drawn a line in the sand. They've said this is where we want to be by 2025. And they'll be putting initiatives in place to be able to do that. But the challenge that we've got is, how do you find best practice? So, you know, you've got a lot of small businesses, you've got a lot of people in the industry who are looking for information, but how do they find it? And what's really interesting is if you try and search for this information, you end up finding information from years ago. So I did a search for leadership in the construction industry, and I found a report from 2003 from a university. And I think the challenge is that a lot of this isn't being made visible. The search engine optimization isn't there. A lot of people are seeing diversity and inclusion as their USP, so they're not necessarily sharing that across the industry. And we need that to change. So this is where the roadmap for change comes into play. So what we did was we took the responses of the survey and we picked out some key themes that were coming out of the survey. And we looked at how we can set a vision for the industry overall and also for the different themes. So for the industry overall, we said that we want an inclusive and attractive built environment that represents the communities that we serve. And these are the key themes that came out of the survey that we're focusing on. So we've got image, an inclusive and attractive industry that represents the community it serves, a sector with a proactive equality, diversity and inclusion culture. We've got progression, a culture that values its people, supporting career aspirations and progression for all. We've got procurement. So we talked about the lowest cost. So we want an industry that's purpose-driven, values itself and gets recognition for it. And that's with a holistic approach to best value in the procurement process. We want inclusive design, an industry that creates good quality spaces for everyone and meets the diverse needs of the community. We want leaders that enable a culture of inclusivity, reflecting the communities that we serve. And technology, an industry that embraces new technology and uses it to drive improvement and performance. So those are the themes that are on our roadmap for change. And what we've done is we've populated some content on there around each theme. So when you go on the website, which is www.roadmapforchange.org.uk, you find the different themes and you find the content that sits behind it. So you'll be able to find information about starting your journey. So for example, for image, if you're going to start your journey, you'd find some information about the Gatsby benchmarks that we've got in the UK. There'll be information from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors about engaging with schools. And then there's more information from people who are a bit further down the road on their journey as well, so that people can learn from each other. And it's all about joining the dots across the built environment. So we've created this platform to share content and resources so that people can help each other. And it's a focal point for this information. But but we need your help. So I think part of what I wanted to say today, and I think this is why it's amazing that we're linking up internationally as well, is that, you know, we need help to be able to get content and to help us build this. So we've created the platform, we've started to populate it, but we just want to find out what everybody else is doing and get them to share their stories, their content, their case studies, things that are improving sort of their organizations and their world, so that we can work together to bring change. So if you have a look on the website, you'll see a subscribe and a contribute button, and we'd love to hear from you and find out what you're doing as well. So yeah, please help us, please get involved, and thank you for the opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you, Maria. So I just want to introduce our final speaker, and then we can open the floor really to discussions and questions. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Amy Freeman, who is the director of the Penn State Millennium Scholars Program, which is a national collaborative initiative that supports undergraduates who are preparing to pursue doctoral degrees in STEM subjects. Dr. Freeman studied architectural engineering, and also has held a number of positions leading both engineering and diversity strategies in higher education. And he's also past president of both the National Association of Multicultural Engineering Programme Advocates and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network. She's a recipient of the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics and Engineering Mentoring, which was sponsored through the White House in 2016. So thank you very much, Amy, over to you. You're on mute, Amy.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate that lovely introduction. One of the things as I listen to the other speakers, as an African-American woman engineer, I can absolutely relate to all of the things that everyone has said so far. When I look at the built environment, there are many different ways to engage in improving the built environment. One of the things that really struck me about this particular topic is that the built environment, whether it's buildings, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's dealing with all of the byproducts and results of this built environment, STEM, science, engineering, math, and technology are all very much involved in some of the problems that we've created. And so the thing that I'll be talking a lot about will be how STEM education and what the role of that is can be used to hopefully in the long term help to remedy some of the issues that we have, particularly as it regards diversity and access. So just a quick overview of my presentation. We've introduced, and you know it's me. We'll talk a bit about STEM in the built environment. We'll talk a bit about diversity in STEM education. And we'll talk about how we create new influences, how we make the future better. So when we look at the built environment and we look for solutions, we have a variety of factors to deal with. One of them is, well, we start with buildings, and I'm an architectural engineer, so I very much appreciate that. But again, the built environment is anything that we've built and anything that we have to deal with, maintain, navigate anything that changes the earth and the global structure, I think is part of the built environment, and they're all so interconnected. So we've got building, and STEM comes in when you look at building design and what kinds of buildings we've created. So when you look at issues of what's a great material now, like asbestos was so wonderful back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and now we know that it gives us cancer and so on. So how do you remove that? So we look at issues of building design. We look at byproducts that come from the things that we've done. And so when you look at that, the STEM there would be, how do we deal with the chemicals? How do we deal with the issues of all the different kinds of pollution that we've created, all of the man-made issues that we did not anticipate when we built our environment. And at the same time, you also have to deal with how do people go to live go on to live healthy in this environment that we've built. So a lot of global issues, come into play here. So when I think in terms of like the topic, diversity and positions of influence, I think the prior speakers again have hit on it very much. One of the questions is, when we look at all the problems that we have to solve, there are many, and you can't solve them all at once. And somewhere out there, someone's deciding who solves which problems. What do we work on? What do we let go? How are resources applied? And so when we look at that question, who decides which problems we're going to work on next? I think that's just such an interesting question. I've seen situations where a community evaluates itself and identifies problems that they need resolved, but others come in and say, instead, we're going to give you this other solution or this other answer. We think we want to do this for you. And so it's an interesting kind of a gift that they receive that they didn't ask for, but and when you view the future, people tend to be more conciliatory and deal with whatever's provided to them. I think there's a kind of a disconnect. When we look at the issue of who decides which problems we work on next, we're talking about how resources are applied, how technical solutions are designed for specific populations of people versus just broadly or a solution that serves one population. How do we initiate or support policy that determines who gets access to each of these solutions that come up? I'm looking at coronavirus, the question of who gets access to the vaccine. Is it free? Is it doled out? Who decides those things? And what is the information that determines decisions that are made? Deciding where and how infrastructure is placed. Why should the highway go through certain neighborhoods and not others? And also when we share global research, how collaborative are all of the players? And that's an interesting conversation when you see who controls intellectual property and things of that nature. So when you look at these questions, I feel it comes down to who the players are. And many of these kinds of questions often come back to the STEM arena. And I understand the humanitarian arena where you're helping people deal with the outcomes of STEM. And but if you go down, as you get closer and closer to the root of some of these problems and their solutions, I feel STEM plays a large part in that. And not just STEM, but the question of who in STEM is navigating. I think against the other speakers, how diverse are the individuals who navigate these arenas? So as we said earlier, how many women are engaged in how buildings are designed and created and these things? How many marginalized populations, how many of their voices are heard in these areas? So for me, when I look at the issue of connecting this with the topic, diversity and positions of influence, those two phrases, diversity and then the phrase position of influence, having lived my life as an African-American woman engineer, I could tell you stories. I really appreciated your contribution, Marie, in terms of the construction industry. My focus area in architecture was building construction. It was a challenge. My question is, how do we get more of a diverse voice in the decision-making areas where things are decided and where we decide what kind of solutions we're going to create, who we're going to provide it for, and how it's going to get distributed. One of the things I know about, I was going to also say there's a strong political component that we don't have time to go into here, but I'm of the opinion that is one of the elephants in the room, as they say, something that it's difficult to talk about, it's a challenge to solve. But one of the things that I just feel is important to do is, if I can't fix it now, can I fix it in the future? What can I do to make a difference going forward? Researchers, when we look at them, they choose their areas of engagement. They bring their own perspectives and lived experiences to the process of research and problem solving. So when you look at that, the process of researchers' relationships to choosing their areas of engagement, bringing their own perspective and their relationship to the process of problem solving, their research reflects a bit of who they are. So you look at something as simple as, I often like the example of heart research and how do you know you're having a heart attack? How do you know, what are the signs? What are the symptoms? What are the causes? Much of that early research was done on majority, in the United States, it would be majority or white men. And so men were doing the research, men had individuals participating in the research who were like themselves. And so therefore they came up with some really great research information, but some of it was not applicable to women. It was not necessarily applicable to underrepresented populations and others. And so therefore it makes the research faulty when you don't have all of the information you need about what makes the heart pump. So another issue I think that's important, I think when you look at researchers and what they choose to solve, what they choose to do, how they navigate, what their politics are, I find that Western leadership models are not necessarily designed to engage diverse perspectives. When we talk about changing, you want change, the change has to run deep to have an effect. And also it's a long-term proposition, nothing changes overnight. So you're talking generations of this and how to change it just in an ongoing kind of a way. When I look at the individuals who suffer from the outcomes of the built environment, many of those individuals, most of those individuals are not in a position to solve the problems that they suffer for, because many of the problems that they suffer from rather require specialized training to solve. And that specialized training is unavailable to most, as some of the speakers had mentioned in terms of who gets access to education. A primary barrier to engaging in solving STEM-related problems is attaining the STEM degree. And so we want more women and more underrepresented populations, more first-generation folks, more folks from other socioeconomic backgrounds engaged in solving these kinds of problems. The first step is attaining a STEM degree. So to accentuate, and the numbers are very different, but very similar to others. At the end of the day, regardless of the numbers and figures you get, you always come up with a gap. So in terms of STEM bachelor's degrees awarded in the United States to women, approximately 28%, and there are many different entities have different numbers that come about 25% to as high as a third. For underrepresented United States populations, that would be African Americans, indigenous populations, as well as Latino or Hispanic populations in the United States, about 23%. So you can see the red is there. When you look at their parity, women are half the US population, but only 28% of the degrees awarded. The underrepresented populations are about 1/3 or 33-ish% of the US population, but only 23% receives bachelor's. And these are, when I look at science, we're not non-medicine related. So we're talking the physical sciences and so on. So I'm a strong proponent of, and I know there's a following of us, I evolved at a time when all of these kinds of ideas were I really appreciate Marie's presentation, just newfangled ideas. What would happen if you put a woman in engineering? How different would the world be if we allowed other people access to this? And so I think that in the last 30 years, we've made some progress towards getting more degrees in the hands of women and marginalized populations at the bachelor's level. Doctoral degrees, I think the next step is the terminal degree, the doctoral degree, the PhD. And when you have it, that's where research can be done. That's where a variety of decisions, a variety of positions of leadership can be accessed that cannot be accessed any other way. And right now it's still, I'm comfortable saying it's still, I want to say new, or, we're just breaking into this, but I think it matters. And this is one of the things that will change the future. So we look at this particular graph. What does parity look like? Women are 50% of the US population, but they are also 50% in medicine. So you can see what parity looks like right there with that. That just looks so beautiful. That's how we want all the lines. If you're 50% of the population, you should be 50% in a given field, okay? So in physical sciences, you see it's lacking. In engineering, you see it go down. In math and computer science, you see it go down in terms of the numbers of PhDs awarded. For doctoral degrees awarded to racially underrepresented populations in the United States, you can see these populations are about a third of the population in the United States, but only 14% in science, 7% in engineering. And I didn't break them all out because that's how low the numbers were. You could just say all of science and also engineering. So when we look at the gaps that we have there, how do you fix those gaps? And I think very often I hear people, well, you know, if we just invite everybody, come one, come all, we smile bigger, we say nicer things, somehow people will magically, come in and it's gonna fix itself, or we treat everybody the same. In my experience, the answer is not at all. You must be intentional, you must be clear, you must understand what the barriers are, you must be intentional about removing those barriers. And so my research area and much of my entire career has been based on how to create STEM intervention programs. And I've created many different types in different environments, and work with folks all over the world in terms of finding those things that make a difference in creating the best STEM intervention. At the end of the day, when you put a person through this process, they come out with a degree in their hand. And so the biggest factors include, there are many, but the key factors. Number one, if you're taking someone who normally would not receive a degree and normally would not be one who at the end would come out with a PhD, the first thing you do when they come into the college environment, their first generation college student, I never been to college. I said I wanted to be an engineer, and I did really good in school, and I'm excited to be at Penn State or whatever the institution is. You have to place them in a learning community where they're surrounded by mentoring, exposure to research, the understanding of their political challenges that come up, early introduction to the scholarly community, strong support also of institutional leadership. And that's big, really big. I think other speakers have talked about that. When you talk about strong support of institutional leaders, that's at the presidential level, which Dr. Crane was talking about, so Robert was talking about the presidential leadership, was talking about, more chancellors, I'm thinking more deans, more folks in academia in terms of what it takes to change an institution. And the question is, how do you diversify that? Well, the first thing I think you have to do is get folks in the position. And so academic, and I think that the first step is getting a degree, and ideally getting a terminal degree in order to make it to that level. Academic preparation, very often we know that students in first generation situations or racially underrepresented in particular will come from under-resourced schools. So you have to be intentional to push students forward. Also, you need the funding and the resources to complete the degree. Penn State's a great place, but if you don't have that tuition in that room and board to the tune of $40,000 or $50,000 a year, it's unlikely that you'll be graduating from the Pennsylvania State University. So it's not cheap, it's expensive. The picture you see here is with the Millennium Scholars Program. It's the one that I direct now. There are many programs across the world. And in the United States, I know there are many, and they have different focus in terms of what the goal is. So a large number of them I know are to push students to the bachelor's degree and get them into industry. This particular program is designed to push students, train undergraduate students so that they graduate with a STEM degree and go directly into PhD programs. And so how to do that, it's a big jump from bachelor's to PhD. And so we've been successful. Most intervention programs across the country have about 70 to 80% graduation rate in STEM fields. And they have in our particular case, going to the PhD, about just over half of these students, 50–60% of them will go into PhD programs directly from the bachelor's. But again, it's intentional. And I think that's one way to change the future. So the product we're producing here is 10 years long. So they'll start as a first-year student. 10 years later, we hope to see them with a PhD, and maybe 20 years later, they are that president of the institution or the leader of that. We're creating leaders. They lead building industry entities or other areas where our built environment can change. So the final couple of slides that I have here, just what happens when you I have the good fortune of watching students. I've done it long enough where I've watched people really become fabulous professionals and humanitarians. But some of the things that happen when you combine STEM education, global engagement, is you add to the number and the variety of solutions that are discovered. So one of the things that we know through our corporate entities, one of the reasons that diversity was so advocated is because it's money. When you give two groups the same problem to solve, one's diverse and one's they're same people, same thought process, the diverse group will have more solutions, better solutions, different ways of doing the solutions because they bring with it their life experience and their different ways of looking at things. So you add to the variety of solutions in the world. You identify solutions for specific populations. One example, I know I had the fortune to hear a Puerto Rican researcher talk about how asthma, you look at all the research on asthma with children, Puerto Rican children are the most likely to die from asthma in the United States. But when you look at all the research is not designed for Puerto Rican children. So they take the same treatments for asthma as anyone else, but it's not what's best for them. So he does only research that affects Puerto Rican children. So that wouldn't happen if you didn't have someone from the community doing this research. You get also improved cross-cultural communication among decision makers. And I think that starts, if we're open-minded, it can happen where we are. And I'm just a strong believer in the next generation is, I just believe cross-cultural communication has a wonderful future in the world. And all of these are pictures of Millennium Scholars and other scholars that I've worked with in the past. You propel the marginalized, when you give someone a STEM degree, you propel a marginalized population into this decision-making level. You place folks in the room. And so they bring with them perspectives that might not have been thought about when we are thinking of ways to improve the world, improve a given community, and look at problems differently. You reduce poverty. One of the other things I've seen in my work is when you put a STEM degree in someone's hand, it's one of the most lucrative and powerful occupations in the world. So at the very least, you bring that student out of poverty, and very often you bring their family out of poverty. And also there are more role models and mentors to inspire another generation of STEM scholars. So that ends my presentation, but I guess we all do our part in our different sectors of the globe. But my particular focus is on how do we include more STEM professionals in the future. And I'm of course of the opinion that the future looks bright. I appreciate your time. And I saw there were a couple of hands out there while I was speaking, so I'll leave that to the question line.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rob Crane, for the welcome remarks. Thank you, Deborah, for moderating. I am moderating alongside Deborah. I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Esther Bonyo. I'm an associate professor of engineering design and architectural engineering at Penn State University. I'm also the director of the Global Building Network. I will put a link to something in the chat. When I started working in the Global Building Network, I found a document in the links that were posted alongside the announcement of the launch of the Global Building Network. It was, the focus is energy use in building, but I found a document that gave me a reason to apply. So I'm adding on what Amy has shared. I struggled with applying for the job, but when I found a document that included issues that affect people who are in the low income categories, both here in the US and other parts of the world, including Africa, I was like, I have to do this job. So sometimes I'm taking responsibility, and I'm also encouraging other people who are in the minority category that sometimes we say no because we think that it's going to be too difficult to get things to be more inclusive in terms of topics that are being researched. And it is hard work, but it can happen. And all you have to do is be prepared, have a thick skin, and have a very strong support network around you. So thank you so much, Amy, for that presentation, and also Maria for sharing the experiences. And we are now going to transition into the question and answer session. I will start with a question that's posed by my friend Larry. He asked, a lot of the books that he used while teaching structural engineering, actually said all, were written by white men like him. And in recent years, there's a little bit of change, but it is not enough. Yeah, why is this the case? Should it change? Why should it change? So that's a very important question. And I would ask the panelists to give us your opinion. Why do you think, maybe we should start with the first part, why do you think the books that are still being used in 2020 in a lot of the technical disciplines in the built environment are still written by white men?
I would say because we have to continue to create the next group of authors. The white men who wrote those books probably have PhDs in STEM. And until we create more women PhDs in STEM and underrepresented populations who have these PhDs in STEM and want to go into academia because they get the PhD, maybe they want to research somewhere else, they go do a variety of things. I think it's just a matter of, there's definitely racial and gender bias in there because an institution could choose to, or maybe a faculty or department could choose to diversify its textbooks and its information that it provides to students. You have to be intentional. But the other thing I would say is it's also critical to address racial and gender issues in academia in terms of who writes the textbooks, which textbooks are picked up and carried in a given institution, and so on.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to pick up on a point that Maria made, and there's a few comments have come through in relation to the representation of a bigger percentage of our sector, actually, and Maria gave some stats there to say that there's 90+% in the UK, which is quite exceptional, but I think it probably reads across to similar levels countries of small, I guess, lifestyle companies who do what they do, and they either inspire people to join them as builders or trades or whatever, and but they are such a significant part of our sector, representing us, and also be a great support and benefit from best practice. So Maria, what do you think that someone like the CIC or any of the professional institutes could do to really encourage a bigger percentage of our supply chain to get behind diversity? Because I suspect in many ways they're probably representing diverse groups because they're family firms. But what's your perception? Because I know that you mentor some of these companies.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. So I think a lot of small businesses are working for larger contractors, so they're part of a supply chain, a supply network. And I think there's a lot of things that the larger contractors could do to encourage the smaller businesses to start to engage in this agenda more. And I think it is happening and I think that links with procurement as well. So there is a lot more that's being looked at as to asking smaller businesses to demonstrate diversity and inclusion in their organization and provide information and data and things like that. So those questions are being asked, which is great. I think there is things starting to happen around creating the business case for fairness, inclusion and respect, and that's one of the things that I teach. So I deliver training for the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and I deliver fairness, inclusion and respect training, and I've written courses specifically focused at small businesses to get them to understand like the business case, the difference it's going to make to their business, to their profitability, sharing some of the great data that's out there, like McKinsey reports and things like that. So starting to open people's eyes to the impact that it could make on the profitability of their business, I think is really important. But I think there's also a lot of work to be done to reach the really small businesses. So the ones that are potentially like they're not part of a supply chain, they might be working in the domestic market, they might be house builders, something like that. Quite often those small businesses are kind of in their own world, and some of them are quite difficult to reach as well. So I think we definitely need to, and I think having something like the Roadmap for Change, where you can signpost people to and say, look, you know, this is a small business, this is what they're doing, this is the impact it's made on their business. They can start to see and follow like what other people are doing. So I think if we can start to collect more case studies and information from other small businesses who are really positively engaging with this agenda, then they can show people the way, and sort of help other people as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to pose the next question to Angela Mwai, who's representing the UN Habitat. Angela is the head of Human Rights and Social Inclusion. Angela, I wanted you to share some of the experiences that you have had working with empowering and educating groups that are traditionally not represented or not present at the decision table. Can you please share some of the experiences based on the situation on the ground? And also share with us a little bit about the gaps, places that you think other people need to rally behind your partnership networks to move the needle on some of these issues.
Thanks very much. I want to go back to what Amy Freeman said. Who decides which problems we will work on or not? And I think in the development field in which we work, I think this is a very key problem, and part of our main role is to influence policy. So at UN Habitat, we work with our biggest constituency, our local authorities, because of course we work in cities. And I think if local authorities do not bring the consumers of their products to the table, then those consumers, be it women, children, people with disabilities, they don't get factored in. You go to places in cities, even city council offices and everything, and you can clearly see this thing was designed and built by a man, because they haven't looked at the small things like ramps for people with disabilities. And I'm talking about some of the local authorities in the Southern Hemisphere, so to speak. And so we keep on insisting that we need to bring women to the table. So one of the things that we do and insist with local authorities, even in our agreements, our cooperation agreements now, is that women must be consulted. Actually, the whole population has to have good and equal representation when projects are being designed, formulated. Not only as beneficiaries, because we are very good at having, 90% of them were women beneficiaries, but what about the people delivering whatever it is, for example, delivering the buildings, delivering the training, providing urban basic services? Where are the women in this whole exercise? So human rights and social inclusion requires that my team looks at projects that are designed all over the world. We are in 4 regions, Arab states, we are in Africa, we are in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then in the Asia Pacific. And we always look at, have they considered the role of women in everything that they're doing, the role of children, the role of older persons. Recently, we had an expert group meeting, actually a series of expert group meetings that talked about inclusive cities. So the first one was on human rights. Of course, we are a human rights-based approach to organization. And as the UN, this is our key tenement that we have to follow. The second one was on older persons and people with disabilities. And the third one was on gender equality. And you could see people always talking about, and we had a diverse selection of stakeholders who kept on saying, they don't ask us, and therefore the services, the buildings, the transport, it's not designed for us. It's not designed to be as inclusive as it should be. And of course, if I bring in the subject of this discussion of diversity, the minority groups are worst affected. They're the ones who live on the peripheries of the cities, so that they're the ones who don't get the services that are based in the center of the cities, where the more affluent, the more educated people live. So I agree with all the previous speakers. STEM is a very important subject. And I'll tell you that internally in UN Habitat, and I'm just thinking in my head, the urban planning and design branch is actually led by a woman. It is, and there are several senior women there and young people and more architects and urban planners who come in to look at the built environment, to look at spatial planning, to look at planning of urban safe public spaces are now more and more by women. And I think that, I mean, we have people from all over the world, but many of them are not from South Sahara. Many of them are from the Western world. So, you know, Amy talked about, you know, the African-American experience, but I think in Africa, it's really, really lacking that we don't have enough women and girls coming out of the STEM, you know, work stream or education stream. And I think it's very important that if young women are encouraged, and they are being now in public schools, to do more of this, you know, science, technology, mathematics, they need to think that it's within their realm of possibility. And this is something that's being promoted in UN Habitat. And I was just texting Esther on the slide to say, it would be really interesting for us. I mean, I don't know traditionally whether you all work in the UN or work with the UN, but it would be interesting to work on a possibility to see how can we build capacity? How can we help those who make the decisions about what is taught do better? So we can help influence some of the decisions that are being made at a much higher level, so that more and more people and young women are coming out of this STEM stream. And it's very, very important. What did I want to talk about? The women of color, only 5% are presidents of international US university. That's what Robert Crane said. And I was trying to think, even in the situation in my own country, Kenya, and Esther is also from my country, I believe, we have a number of chancellors who are women, but very few. And so it seems as if there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that if we put our minds together as a sort of a community of practice, and I'd like to suggest this as an outcome of this meeting, is that we form a community of practice to see how we can change the situation for everybody, and you know, to bring more and more professionals looking at the, you know, built environment, but who are women, who are people with disabilities, who are minorities, who have different gender identities. I think a chance needs to be open for everybody. I hope I've answered your question. I was rambling on a little bit, but thanks.
Thank you. Deborah.
Hi, I was just, it's interesting listening to the speakers actually, and one of my questions, and it's just going to be an open question to the panel rather than somebody else's, is, you know, increasingly there are more groups, there are more networks, there are people who are trying to, I guess, inspire and promote, and also case studies of good practice. Is that enough? How do we convert that, which is some good collateral and some good examples and some real best practice, and how do we convert that? How do we connect these groups together to work on bringing this through to industry? Because I wonder whether the makeup of some of the groups who talk about the challenge, either they have personal experience or they understand it, or they're bringing their own discipline to that. How many of them themselves are in positions of influence to actually get ground level change? I don't know, Matt, and what your thoughts are on, maybe on Maria, but also Robert, as the position you are in an institute. Have you seen a shift or a change in the time that you've been there, or in your career? And it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of about women in particular, but just a change of the ability for people to convert to practice.
Sure, we've seen change.
First, Robert, on that. Yeah.
It was, I think I was an associate dean in one of our colleges sort of 25 years ago or so, when we were first asked to produce a diversity plan. And this is a STEM college. Amy knows it really well, right? The mineral sciences. And it's got a mix of engineering and science disciplines. And the dean at the time, who was in every other respect was a great dean, but his diversity plan was simply to say, we welcome everybody. We want the best. We don't care who they are. If they're the best, we'll take them. And Amy's absolutely right. That doesn't work, right? You have to be a whole lot more intentional than that. And I think over time, it really has changed. So I was talking about presidents because that's what you can find data on very easily. But if you look just within Penn State, and Amy may agree or disagree, she's been around Penn State a while as well, but you know, the number of women and minorities of any sort that you find as deans now and institute directors, department heads, that's all increased dramatically over the last 10 or 20 years. I think it's still a challenge to make that last leap to becoming the provost or the president. So I still think we've got work to do there, but things are definitely improving. But I would also say that you don't get any change in the institution until you can get that leadership change, because it's very hard to have any impact if you don't have the leadership of the university behind you or the leadership of the college. So putting people in those positions of influence, I think, is critical.
Thank you, Robert. Maria, do you just want to pick up on maybe your experiences, what you've seen in groups like CIC or other industry representation groups, or indeed some of your clients?
Yeah, I mean, there is not enough diversity in leadership positions in the industry, both in the people in the industry who are trying to make it better, you know, so the different sort of voluntary organizations that are trying to improve the industry. There's not enough diversity there, but also there's not enough diversity, obviously, in leadership positions in the industry either. And I think part of the challenge is that leaders, that it's not enough on their radar because it doesn't impact them. You know, if they're sitting around in their board meetings and everybody looks like them, they're not bothered, you know, because they've got their own agenda, they've got their own sort of network going on, and they're not seeing enough, they don't understand enough, I think, the difference that it can make and the positive impact that it can have. So I think we definitely need to be doing more to really sort of get those messages home to the leaders. And there was one thing that sprung to mind just through this conversation. I was reminded of Dame Helena Morrissey, who started the 30% Club in the financial, so she's from the financial sort of sector. She started the 30% Club as a way of getting more women onto boards. So they found that, you know, that the research says that the real tipping point for diversity is if you've got the 30% diversity on boards, and that's when you start to make the difference. And she started the 30% Club to really encourage leaders, and she got all of these leaders from the financial organizations to really back it, and it made a difference. So, you know, I think we need to find ways to engage with the leaders more.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you, Maria. So I'll ask the next question, if that's okay, Deb. There's a question, there are two questions. I'll ask the one from Holly first. To the panelists, are we in danger of encouraging young people into careers where they experience a lack of belonging or being different without the skills and training to navigate an undiverse workplace? I want to share my answer before I invite other people. Do you see the first or best change needed as cultural, leadership, policy, education, or something else? I would say something else. So my story is the person who's always the other person. And sometimes it's as bad as, I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Nairobi, the only girl in the whole class. My father found out and he was like, I'm taking her out. and his idea was go to medicine, there are more women there. And I'm sharing this because a girl who's in my position needs to hear this. I didn't want to do medicine, but that was the option that was being made available to take me out of feeling isolated. Thankfully, my classmates within that group of men, they rallied around me, so I did not feel isolated. There is a role that people who are in the majority can play that has been a beneficiary. I've been a beneficiary of that. When I started work as an assistant professor, again, yeah, you're working and like, I'm alone. Should I run away? I'm like, I'm going back to England. That's why I did my graduate school. And there were people who were in the majority category, including Larry, who's in the call right in the webinar right now, who stepped up and said, we are here for you. You're not alone. And then moving fast forward to Penn State University, there are times when I say I'm running back to Florida, which is where I was before I came here, And people like Amy and Rob Crane and others have stepped up and say, you have us. My department chair in engineering design, Sven Bill, and they step up and they say, you have us. So I'm sharing this as my personal story, that I could be isolated very easily. But every time when I'm at risk of running away because of fear of isolation, somebody who's in the majority category has stepped up and told me you're not alone. I'll invite the panelists also to share their responses on that question, to that question.
My entire life has been one, if I tell you how old I am, but my entire life has been one of firsts. I'm just like, in this life, I was the, I remember in high school, I was I went ahead and took the math. I had a few girls there, but then I took engineering, drafting, and drawing, only girl there. And at the time, I was not aware of all the gender issues. I just assumed other girls wanted to take it. I should tell them they should. And they're like, why would I take that? So I was kind of it wasn't until I got really to university where it became clear it was intentional. They don't want you here, And so I was the only woman to graduate with my bachelor's degree in my major quite some time ago. I'll just say it was in the 80s. I was the only woman in my major to graduate with a master's degree, or, at that time, or the second woman, the first Black woman. So I understand issues of isolation. And I've already told God, in my next life, I don't want to learn anything new. I want the sidewalk with the handrail. I'm tired of tearing all the bushes down and building the city and doing all that. But I can say, when I look long term, things are better. And so when I see girls, and usually it's not the girl. The girl wants to, like you were sitting in the class because you wanted to be there. It's the parents and the prior generation saying, oh my God, you're alone. What are we going to do? I find that there are many, many forums that can help people, help alleviate the isolation. I've created a lot of them. I've been involved in the inception of many, many of them. And so what I would do is just, and something I've done where I see a girl who's in a place and she's trying to do whatever it is, and she's maybe in a place of isolation. I mean, I've gone in my pocket and said, here, you need to go to this conference. I will make sure you go to that and pay your registration so you can see other girls and you're not alone in the world. And so I think the future looks bright. It is getting better. Again, progress is very slow, but if it's going to change, somebody's got to be first. And so if we have an army of these wonderful women and people of color and first generation students who dare to be first, we encourage them to be first. We don't say, oh, it's hard being first. Why don't you go for like second or third? No, somebody's got to, if you're going to change in the world, it's not for the faint of heart. So I would say we support them. And even if you can't live someone's life, maybe you can create a forum where they feel encouraged doing what they are doing. And so I'll pause.
So this is something which you can tell is personal for Amy and I. We are in the lowest representation of all minorities, Black women in a very white, male-dominated field. But then, we want to just also say that I wanted to reinforce what Amy is saying, that it can be done. And it's not it can be done, it needs to be done. I started venturing in the direction of this topic maybe a year ago. I was afraid of drawing attention to the fact that I am in the otherness category. So I never wanted to touch on any topic that reminds people that I'm either a minority, double minority, triple minority. I will do anything except try to remind people I'm in the room and I'm alone. Yeah, a year ago, I needed to share this because that's how my journey into this topic started. A gentleman who's in the webinar today, his name is Richard. I call him my citizen participation specialist. I was telling him about a project we were doing in New Kensington, in a Rust Belt city. It's economically depressed. They were doing okay during steel manufacturing years. After the steel manufacturing years ended, the biggest employer left, unemployment at an all-time high, and it takes an impact on the buildings right away. There is no money for repairing things when they get broken. And over time, the roof is leaking. There's a lot of damage to the building fabric. So I started participating in this conversation because architectural engineering, I can talk about the roof and the materials. And Richard started encouraging me, saying, you're on top of the roof. You need to go lower than the roof. And I'm like, okay, indoor air quality. And he's like, no, lower than the air. And I'm like, where? And he's like, look at the people. So I'm like, you do know I'm a professor of architectural engineering? And he said, yes. And Richard reminded me, you are in a context where the people who are living in those houses, if it is a Black family, the girl who's there has never seen a person who looks like her wake up in the morning and go and do a white collar job. So Richard challenged me and told me, you are in a very unique position. You can impact the life of the next Black girl. This is my story. This is how I got into this topic. So I'm answering a question that George said was a follow-up question. And there was also another question, should we wait until the leaders who don't understand what they need to do leave? And I'm saying, no, we don't wait. Let's just give the people who are willing, who are brave enough, let's give them the support that they require, and it's gonna get done.
And that same question, do we bottom up or top down? You need both. You need all the pieces. You need everybody doing everything that we possibly can to make this change. I think one of the things was, do we just wait for all of them to retire? If you have no people to fill those positions when they retire, then they'll retire and be replaced with the same, unless you are also developing the next generation of individuals. I think to Esther's question, where I really appreciated your example in terms of being a role model or an example to others like us for where they can go. But in the United States, we also call that the Black tax. You do your work as an architect or architectural engineer, you do your job as university administrator, then you have this other job that white folks don't do, which is, I've got to go be the Black role model, and it's exhausting. One of the things I kind of look at, it's exhausting, it's heavy, it's a lot, but for me, I can't not do it. How do I look into the eyes of a girl who looks like me and tell her what she can't do? You know, all right, I said I wasn't gonna, come on, I got chili, let's go eat dinner. And so it's kind of, I just think it's a part of, at this point in time, it may not always be, but at this point in time, that is another piece that we bring. When you include marginalized people, you include whether it's sexual orientation or ability or money or whatever it is, when you bring others to the table, it broadens everybody's perception, and it helps everyone. I think when you bring more people to the table, you bring more people to the table. We all attract ourselves. So white men, you know, no diss on them, they attract themselves and we attract ourselves, or we are attracted to ourselves. There's something about connecting with someone who's like yourself. So I just feel like the journey is still exciting. I over the last 30 years, I've seen incredible progress. I know the next, I just wonder, what will the next 30 years look like? So hopefully all of our work will have yielded some good things by then.
Deb, you want to ask the next question, please? Thank you, Amy.
So actually this was from Angela. So in building projects, how do you rope in women as suppliers of services? Do women have equal opportunity? So again, this is back to the, you know, who's in the frame, who's in the supply chain. Do people get a fair chance to offer up their services into the industry, or does the industry itself inadvertently, I guess, discriminate or go with those that they already know? And it's yet another barrier, isn't it, for people of different backgrounds, different race to infiltrate, to integrate into a wider community. So I don't know, again, if anyone has any experiences of that. One of my questions also is in relation to, I know that say in the UK there are it's about 11% of our population are of Asian origin, and there's 8% in our industry, of which 2% are leaders, but a big chunk of those are doing it in their own businesses, not in what we would consider to be the mainstream, and they're servicing their own community. So, you know, it's as if you're getting your own cluster of, they want to be good builders, they want to be good tradesmen, they want to run their own businesses because maybe they don't aspire to want to work for a big corporate, and then they service their own communities, and we don't get interaction. So I don't know whether, Maria, maybe you've got some comments on the supply chain interaction dynamic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely more and more women coming through on the trades, and I think there's initiatives that are helping in that. So I was on a parliamentary commission last year looking at how we get more women into the industry, and we had a presentation from an organisation called Women into Construction, and they're encouraging women, so from the different communities and things like that, to get involved and to get learn skills and get a trade and things like that. So there are more initiatives happening, and I think the new things that are being looked at high level in the industry around procurement, I think will start to encourage that more as well, because I think there will be in future sort of targets set around procurement and especially it being linked to the communities where you're procuring in. I think there's a lot of lessons being learned around that at the moment and trying to encourage more and more opportunities for the communities and the people in them.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So what we are going to suggest, George Forden, who communicated with you before and also yesterday telling you about the logistics for the webinar, we are going to work with him to set up something on LinkedIn and Twitter where we can continue with the conversation. I know there was a very good question about leadership from DK, and we want it answered. We don't want to put a pressure and rush through it. So we definitely are going to look into the issue of also setting up a community of practice. And I felt it would be amiss because we are a university, Penn State, and our friends are both universities and non-universities. We have a role within global programs that's called strategic partnerships that falls under Rob Crane. This is something that he's invested a lot of effort in over the years. So I thought it would be nice to hear from him, give us just a couple of minutes on where you see things going in the future. Like, how should we position ourselves to make an impact? We don't want this to be, we met, we talk, we have a lot of interesting ideas, and then that was it. From a strategic partnership perspective, based on what you're hearing, what are your thoughts?
We're going to have a conversation later, you and I. I mean, that's difficult. I think one of the things we have to do, right? One of the things we do, the reasons why we build strategic partnerships. If you look around at any university, pretty much any university in the world, it's going to talk about global engagement and how important it is. And it's going to talk about the need for partnerships and working with others. And if you dig deeper into most of those universities, you'll find there's very little substance behind that, right? There are very few groups, very few institutions who have really worked out what does a strategic partnership really mean and how do you set about building it. And I think one of the secrets here is that we tend to build relationships based on who we know, and those tend to be personal, and it's very hard to institutionalize those. And I think one of the things we have to do, both with our partnerships, but also with what you're doing here, is you actually have to get beyond the personalities, right? So that if Amy stops working tomorrow, does her program disappear, or has it become so institutionalized that it continues? And if this group sort of finds different things to do tomorrow, does the partnership that you've started to create around this theme, does that continue or not? So I think one of the first things you have to do with any sort of strategic partnership is move it beyond the point where it depends on individuals to make it happen. So we need to build this partnership with UN Habitat. We need to build with BRE Trust and Penn State, but we need to do it in a way that the programs become institutionalized and the networking, the networking is permanently there. And one of the ways we need to, we get to make that happen is to do things that we couldn't possibly do on our own. So I think as you build this sort of partnership around this theme, you need to think about, well, what if Penn State was doing it, what would we do? And what can't we do unless we partner? And then when you can find those programs or projects or those networks or the people you interact with, when you find those that you can't do on your own, but you can only do in a partnership, then that's where you focus and you start to build those programs, and that's what then makes it institutionalized. So I would say, to move this forward around this theme, we need to think of things that none of these organizations could do on their own, that you need a partnership to make it happen. And once you start to build that partnership, we need to build programming that becomes institutionalized and isn't dependent on any individual. That's the sort of philosophy we work on in our strategic partnerships. And I think it works just as well here too.
Deb, you're muted.
Sorry. It's been a very interesting discussion, and we're up to time now. I think, as you'll see in the chat, this has been recorded, and we're going to produce a sort of report summary of the event and share that. But so it just leaves it to me to thank everybody for their contribution. Thank you to Robert and to Amy and to Maria and to Angela, and also pass on our thanks to Ms. Sharif for her recorded, and obviously Esther, you know, you're my buddy in this, and we talk every week about all sorts of things, and this has come out of this. So, and also thanks to Stephen and George and to Kevin behind the scenes to make it all happen. So good afternoon, everybody.